All right, welcome back everyone to the afternoon session. Um, let's hop right in. So we're going to go through another agenda that has to do with what we showed you this morning, and that is focused on a modeling overview, looking at a national market. Remember, we're connected to markets, and it's very important for us to understand not just the cost of our portfolio, but how that interacts with the markets. Our individual portfolios we've developed, some of the results, preliminary results we've looked at, uncertainty that has yet to be done, and how we balance cost and risk in an action plan. So those are the items for this afternoon. There will be time at the end for both chat questions and time for public comments. So this should go a little quicker than this morning's session. So I think we'll give you, hopefully have a little bit more time. And we're going to ask if you are going to make public comments that you make yourself visible as well, so we can see who you are and have a good dialogue that way. So we'll be doing that in a couple hours or hour and a half. Our key timeline then, when we started this process back in March, we were laying out the development of the framework with the goal of trying to complete the process by December. And we've always cautioned that creating IRP reports can sometimes be time consuming. So while preliminary results would be available perhaps, but maybe not the full report written. But where we're sitting right now, I think we feel comfortable perhaps even having the report done, and that would be our goal. It does coincide a little bit with how we do our rate making with the agency. So there's kind of a dual workload that we need to balance a bit and work on that process. But this is our second community focus. We're spending a lot of time modeling now. We did our indicative RFP. These are all things we anticipated. And now it's just getting in, rolling up our sleeves, looking at the risk and the uncertainties of any given plan, and giving the board some direction on what we believe is a recommendation for an action plan, and some back and forth with any of their questions. Encompass is the model we talked about earlier. This is our early chronological production cost model. Does integrated resource planning. It's an optimization model, so it looks at all the possible combinations and optimizes around that, and allows us to do valuation and risk. And I've talked about this model numerous times if you've been participating in either these community focus groups or any board meetings. It's an important cog of what we do. So what we like to have in the models spit out a lot of, you put in the input parameters and you think about the uncertainties that go around it, and let the model results fall out of that. And that's an important aspect for us. It takes some of the emotion out of it and said, we know what these alternative cost. Now there could be other non-quantifiable things, some risks that are factors, some other things that are going on in the communities, for instance. But that gives us a starting point to say this is the least cost plan or the least risky plan, and those might not be mutually exclusive ideas, and they could be. We have a second model called corporate finance, and corporate finance, then we run it through and look at average system rates, our balance sheets, the individual member rate components, demand, energy transmission, pro forma financials, that's a big part of that, and financial metrics. We spend a lot of time as an agency developing metrics we need to measure and adhere to as we move forward. So that gives you kind of an idea of the overview of the modeling process. So let's start off with the idea of our national model. In our national model, we're modeling every generating asset in all of the 48 states, and then the 7 provinces of Canada that are interconnected to the United States. And the purpose of that interconnection to Canada is there's a lot of power that flows down through the hydro. We want to know the impact on that and how it affects the overall rates in the United States. Why do we model some area that big? Well, if there's policy issues, and I've modeled through the years, for instance, if there's a clean power plan, we'll talk about that later as well, but a clean power plan that the Obama administration had, or if there's some other, something else that will affect the entire nation, you want to understand that because it affects cascading effects through interconnection grids. There's 3 synchronous grids. There's the west of the Rockies, that's WEC. East of the Rockies is the Eastern Interconnect, and then Texas is called ERCOT. And you'll see there's ties between those synchronous grids with DC ties, direct flow ties, that kind of tie those together. But generally there's 3 distinct areas that we look at. And then Canada's tied into one of those 3, or 2 of the 3 in fact. west or east. Out of our model, so this is, again, we use Encompass for this. So Encompass just isn't a portfolio model. We modeled all the United States with that. And we model out to the year 2050. That seems to be a very important year for people as they look out for climate legislation or anything else. So we'll certainly, as the year goes by, we'll go past 2050. But that's kind of a target, and it gets us well past our planning horizon of 2042, which is our 20-year window. But this is a stacking order of the various different types of resources. The resources that we're looking at on a reference case, it shows nuclear stacked on top by coal, combined cycle units that come in, hydro units, and then the orange area is solar. So you see solar growing. The green area is combined cycle units. You see them expand through time. And we have a shrinking base load of coal that there hasn't been any new coal built since 2012, I believe. I don't think there'll be any in the future unless things dramatically change in terms of public perception and legislation and other things. So right now, coal is generally a resource that's not being built. Nuclear, large plant, there's some under construction right now, but very few. A lot of cost overruns, a lot of cost delays. People are very excited, perhaps, of the smaller modular nuclear reactors that you can bring in on a truck and set down, and you don't have all the construction risk and cost overruns and other things. And in terms of climate, of course, they are zero carbon emitting resources. But for those that are very keen on what's going on with climate change, the shrinking nuclear is a problem, because you look at, that's a big source of generation that's carbon free and needs to be replaced at something, and it's largely being replaced in this particular case with combined cycle and some renewables mixed with it. Under high natural gas price, so this is another resource mix, the model automatically goes out and you put in candidate resources and you put in the existing portfolio. It's going to retire and add units and adjust accordingly to a changing input. In this case, if you put in higher natural gas prices, you'll notice the combined cycle portion shrunk down and the renewable piece got bigger. That only makes sense. Maybe we didn't retire some of the nuclear units that we showed earlier, or coal units, because natural gas prices were high enough to make them not have to retire through automatic retirements and uneconomical dispatch. If you look at no natural gas, that's the flip side. You'll see that coal's gone but a sliver all the way out to 2050. A lot of the nuclear plants are gone. That's the pressures that those are both under, and lots of combined cycles come in. Combined cycles are very efficient, a very high efficiency, and if it's a very low fuel price, it's very difficult for nuclear and coal to compete. They can't. And in fact, you'll notice a thinner slice of renewables as well. A lot of those renewables are driven by state mandates, so they still get built even if they're not economical, simply because of state legislation. If there's a carbon tax put in, you'll see coal disappears really fast and nuclear hangs in there. We don't see any trailing off of nuclear because under a carbon scenario, it does well. We shrink down in the combined cycles and see a bigger slice of renewables. So those are different slices and scenarios. We're going to take the ordered pair of input drivers and outputs, feed those through our own portfolio. So whatever prices came out of these runs, that's the same prices we'll use in our scenarios, and then we'll know how those scenarios shake out. To give you some individual comparisons, of those scenarios, we had 9, but I selected 4 in this one. You'll see under the nuclear case, it shows how the generation either drops down, or in the case of the blue line, the carbon tax, how nuclear hangs in there. A nuclear license is 40 years. A lot of times you get a 20-year extension, and we've seen it where there's been an additional 20-year extension recently. So that gets an 80-year life out of a nuclear plant. And then maybe that's getting close to the end. I'm not sure anybody's even considered going further than that. But so you're seeing nuclear power plants that are getting some extensions, but even after they got the extension, there's a lot of pressure. We've seen some recent announcements in Illinois for those plants saying, we can't make it without any extra payments, and we're just going to have to retire. So it's a circular problem. If nuclear retires, climate the climate people will say, well, I lost out on a good source of carbon-free resources. So you take 1,000 megawatt nuclear plant, it takes a lot of wind and solar to make up for that. So 1,000 megawatts of nuclear is not equivalent to 1,000 megawatts of wind and solar because they don't run at nearly as high a capacity factor. You need 3 times as much, or 4 times as much in some cases. We see coal dwindling, and there's certain cases where it recovers and bounces and up a little bit, but overall coal's it keeps declining under all cases. Combined cycles, depending on the price of natural gas, is what drives some of those different paths that it goes along. Wind resources continue to grow, and a lot of that, again, is driven by some state legislation in addition to the economics, as is solar. And certain states that might have a renewable standard, and they also might have an additional standard of a certain percent has to be solar. There's been a lot of states that lay those out. They're really trying to promote and get solar put into the system. That's probably not quite as necessary now. Solar is very competitive now, as we've seen in our RFPs, and they have a nice niche place in the portfolio that fits in for on-peak generation. Certainly nothing on the off-peak, but and then wintertime, there's always a concern. And utility scale batteries. You'll notice what's going on in the projection that's inside our the Horizons database. Very flat, not a lot of additions until we get maybe 10 years out. That has to do with the economics of batteries, that the model says they're not quite there yet, but there's this learning curve where they get cheaper and cheaper. So if we see batteries start to scale up, it's going to be more that they've gotten some either mandates or subsidies or something that's had people try them out more. Otherwise, there's this idea that it's going to take a bit to be competitive before they make that crossover. And then towards the end, last 10 years, you'll see that competitiveness and batteries take off. The amount of CO2 released then under these different scenarios is the carbon tax is certainly very low, and the other ones have some paths that they're somewhat low as well. So that's the kind of things we look at from a national basis in our market model, and we want to understand all the drivers that drove that market model and put it into our portfolio. Okay, let's talk about portfolios now. So let's talk about KYMEA specifically and the portfolios we're looking at. I showed this graph this morning, and this has to do with our 3 decision points, 2022, 2027, and 2029. In the near term, we're going to focus on really the 2022 case in that purple area we talked about where we did the indicative RFP, and even a bit on 2027. That's 5 years out, and we have time to adjust and react, but we would call that kind of our near-term window. The reason we say that is that's where some transmission drops off in 27, but a lot of our PPAs are still in place. For instance, our Big Rivers Wilson PPA still got a couple years yet, as does Paducah. But there's kind of an ability to adjust at that point in time as well. In this graph, we show Benham and Berea joining the agency. They haven't committed to that, certainly. They want to see the results of this IRP, but this is, we included them in there because they wanted to be included in our planning process. So the RFP responses, we're going to look at this starting at the left. Purchase power agreements, ownership or options, we saw out of the RFP. Non-dispatchable and dispatchable resources, that came out of the RFP as well. And if you look at those, there's a combination to say, if you want to dispatch it, what's that look like? Run it through the model. What if we own it? Heather pointed out very clearly today about how rating agencies view purchase power agreements and debt in a similar fashion. So we could issue bonds. Now, bonds have a long life. Let's say they were 20-year bonds. Our purchase power agreement with Ashwood's 20 years as well. So you can talk about some trade-offs on bond financing, purchase power agreement, who takes the risk. There's all things for the board to consider and for us to present to the board for their consideration. But that's the combinations. Dispatchable is what we're used to right now. It feels really good to be able to call on a unit and know it's there, not call on it if it's not in the money, and that gives us a lot of comfort as we got started. As we go to more non-dispatchable, then we're managing with a different type of strategy, and that is how do you blend contracts together and maximize your, make your least cost dispatch in that regard. The same graph we looked at earlier, there's that gray area in the middle of intermediate capacity and energy we identified that we want to figure out what we need to do. Some of that could be left to the spot market. Some of it we could shore it all up pretty early on for that 5-year period, and those are strategies we'll look at. In terms of solar, so there's a key factor that changes. We've talked about Ashwood already, but the Vistra 3-year PPA, that's the coal PPA with Vistra, who used to be called Dynegy, from the Joppa plant. That was a 3-year deal, expires March 31st of 2022. In its place, partially in its place, is Ashwood, about 54 megawatts, and that begins a little bit later, December 1st of 2022. So we looked at projected solar additions. There could be a second tranche of 30-ish in 2027, and that's a pretty good chunk of solar for both where we're starting off with and trying to understand the intermittency and how we follow it, and then the next piece perhaps in 2027. So I want to talk a little bit about Ashwood because I'm afraid there's some misconceptions out in the public that we don't have any renewable in our portfolio. We've seen that on a lot of feedback, and I'm not sure how this got missed because we've made a lot of efforts to announce it, but we're going to talk about it again. The Ashwood solar site is an 86 megawatt site, 54 is for KYMEA, another 32 is for Owensboro, who is a KYMEA member. So 2 separate contracts, but we're in the same site. So it's really a KYMEA member site project. It's a 20-year deal, comes online December of 2022. It's about 9% of our energy needs, and it's the equivalent to 18,000, nearly 19,000 rooftop solar installations. So let me say that again. It's equivalent to nearly 20,000 rooftop solar installations, if you think about it. So that's a lot of rooftops. And the economies of scale that go with a big site like this or rooftop gives people the idea that said, we have renewable energy and it doesn't have to be on your roof. Now, if a customer wants to put it on the roof and make that investment, that is totally up to them, and that's fine, of course. That's their investment decision. But we want to let the membership know that Ashwood Solar 1 is a big project. It's our project. We've committed to it, and we have renewable portfolios in both solar and hydro. To give you an idea, we've really been a pioneer in it. We were the first ones to announce. Now, there are little solar projects around prior to that, but we were the first ones to announce a really big project in Kentucky before anybody else ever did. And we were told, were it not for our decision to put in Ashwood, that solar developers were kind of passing over the state and they showed very little interest. Our Ashwood site is nearly 10 times bigger than anything else going on in Kentucky right now. So it's a very big site. 86 megawatts, 800 acres, that's bigger than a square mile. And, that's a commitment. Since our commitment of Ashwood, these yellow dots show that others has followed suit. So now we're seeing other 100 megawatt, 160 megawatt announcements in Kentucky. But we feel like we've broken the ground, and we've been told that by some of the other ones that are putting in the solar, saying they were watching what we did, learned from our experience, and followed suit. So we're pretty proud to say we were one of the ones that brought in big solar into Kentucky. And that was a decision by the board that they carefully looked at based on economics and based on a portfolio mix, what we talked about earlier. To talk about solar irradiance, so this is a map that's put out by NRAIL. You'll see that clearly the best sites are not here. They're over in Nevada and California and all the places you'd expect where the sun shines, Arizona and New Mexico. If you look at the corner of Kentucky, where we're putting Ashwood is the best part of the state. That's the highest irradiance. You'll see it kind of trickles over into that corner, and that's where our project is. And other projects that have been presented to us seem to always go to that direction. Remember, a solar developer, it costs them the same amount to put in these panels, so how they get paid based on megawatt hours produced, they want it to produce as much as possible. They're looking for all kinds of ways for it to track the sun, to have bifacial so it pulls off even more energy that bounces off the ground. Anything they can do to get as much out of a panel as they can. And that makes a lot of sense from their investment point of view. And from our point of view, it just gives us more solar, but we're paying the same price, dollars per megawatt hour. So that gives us an idea of where the solar is at and how we compete with these other regions. So it's been suggested a lot of times as, well, there's way cheaper solar than out there in different places. Well, that's certainly is West Texas and Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, all the places where it's deep red and it'll bake you when you're out in the sun. It's just hot and the solar irradiance is very strong right there. So in terms of our site, sometimes when you say 86 megawatts, and we try to put it in perspective on the number of rooftops, but if you look at the number of sites east of the Rockies, so that's away from all these sites that have the best solar in Texas or Nevada, New Mexico, California, there's only 5 operating sites that are greater than the size of our proposed plant, or our plant that's been committed to. And those sites are, give me while I shuffle. One of them's in Colorado, which has very good solar as well. It's probably debatable if that's east of the Rockies or in the Rockies. There's one up in Minnesota that's been committed to. One in a couple, the rest of them down in the kind of the southeast or on the coast there. Our site is a big part of our portfolio. The rest of these, 9% I mentioned, everybody else that's doing it, even inside the state, if you're looking at Kentucky utility, LG&E Kentucky Utilities, 100 megawatts on their 7,000 megawatt systems, way different than 854 megawatts on a 300 megawatt system, for instance. So it's a big commitment by the agency, and that's why we're concerned about intermittency of solar, how much we can handle, how much we have to get used to and understand on our portfolio. So when I talk about intermittency of solar and how much we can handle, let's talk about the most we can handle. That's set up by looking at the same March time period that California looked at this morning, and we were talking about the duck curve, and that is if the red dotted line is solar and the blue line is load, we can't really design solar to be any greater than the load unless you put batteries in. Then you're actually putting in more solar and charging up batteries, and there's only so much of that you can do as well. The batteries hold a charge, you want to discharge, and so forth. But overall, that a maximum amount of price is 105 megawatts. That's the most we can put internal to our system. If you put any more than that, we would have to, and try to sell the excess, we would have to buy transmission to ship it out of the LG&E Kentucky Utility System into MISO, for instance. And then we'd have to buy transmission inside MISO or PJM to sell it. Or we could do non-firm and take a chance that it's available. So it's not a prudent investment decision to put in more solar than your load can handle. So that's kind of, you say, well, 105 seems about the max, and you will ever want to go to the max. I talked before about a duck curve for California. We have the same issue here. We're very much like an island unto ourselves, connected to a couple of markets, as Rob described earlier. The tail of the duck is our load. It's a peak summer day. The belly of the duck you see dropping down. So that blue line represents a peak day for us. You'll see how it peaks out in the afternoon, late afternoon. If we take solar, and you'll notice by netting solar against our peak, you'll see that it keeps knocking down and gives a shape of a duck. But once you've reached a point of saying, okay, I keep knocking it down, we have the exact same issue that California has. That is, our peak occurs later in the day. We haven't removed that peak and knocked it down. It just occurs now at a later part of the day. So we have to plan our system to account for a peak that occurs in the evening hours after the sun goes down. And that's an important thing to think of. I think it's often overlooked, where people look at reserve margins and blindly think, well, I can just keep adding and look at my reserve margin keeps improving, but you're forgetting about deliverability and operations, and that's an important aspect. So there's 3 lines on there. That's the 54 megawatts, another tranche of 30-some megawatts after that takes us to 86, and then 105 represents what we would call the max. If you look at a winter day, you'll see the winter's got the double hump shape, the shape of the solar's different as well, and the angle of the sun and all those things. And you'll notice that the solar, when the load peaks, both in the morning and the evening, there's really not even any solar generation going on. So it doesn't help us at all to get across the peak. It does help us with energy, of course, but that's the solar in the winter is kind of a non-help in terms of serving load, peak load, that is. Okay, so our long-term portfolio, if we gray out those first 2 decision points and from the RFP, we wanted to look at different aspects, saying once we get out in the future, in 2030, it was asked by numerous people on the feedback saying, well, can we be 100% renewable? We thought, well, let's look at that case and try to understand what that really looks like. And the other one's what we would call a balanced portfolio. So that looks at renewables, it looks at gas, it looks at reliability, and it looks at cost and all the other things that go with it as well. And we're trying to balance those two cases, or compare those two cases. So let's look at the first case. Pull up the slide here. Okay, so the first case has to do with what we call the balanced portfolio. It looks at 86 megawatts of solar inside our system. It looks at 32 megawatts coming from TVA, so that's the SEPA hydro. It looks at internal to our system, some small gas units adding up to 67 megawatts, and it looks at the Paducah peakers at 90 megawatts. So those are internal resources inside the system. Balanced with that is a transmission tie that goes outside to MISO of 165 megawatts, and part of that tie is hedged with 100 megawatts of combined cycle. So combined cycle units are very larger gas-fired units that are extremely efficient, so their carbon footprints are much smaller than like a peaking gas unit, certainly smaller than a coal unit. And that's I showed graphs before nationally about the amount of combined cycles being put in place. That would be a consideration of participating in someone else's plant, not building it ourselves. So a 100 megawatt slice of that. So this is what we would call a balanced portfolio. It includes natural gas, it includes hydro, it includes solar, it includes some intermittent following resources like reciprocating engines that follow that load. And these are all important things to basically keep the lights on. The ability to react very quickly to changes in that solar portfolio and keep the costs low. So that's the balanced portfolio view. The next view, the net zero portfolio, that has to do with that adds up to 131 megawatts of solar. So that's the 54 and 32 we just talked about, and another 45, and I'll show you how we got to that number in a second. It looks at 350 megawatts of wind, tremendous amount of wind. It looks at 32 megawatts of hydro, the SEPA that we have, and a big transmission tie to MISO. So we're relying on the MISO market, and we're hedging it with net zero, or zero emitting carbon. So I want to be clear about that. We're still buying hourly from the MISO market, which whatever resource mix that's made of, but on the offset, we're planning to put enough carbon-free resources to offset and to get to carbon neutrality. And that's important distinction to understand. Often when you hear somebody say, hey, we're going to be 100% carbon-free, they're relying on carbon resources to be able to do that. And if everybody made that same statement at the end of it, somebody said, well, it can't be me because there's not enough thermal resources to follow that. Now, if it's 100% carbon-free with all batteries or some different future, that's a different world. But right now, the world we're living in has to do with a good balanced mix of resources to be able to serve load. So the way we got our mix was we look at average day for the year. We loaded up wind, that 350 megawatts of wind. We loaded up the solar, remember that was 131 megawatts. And we have our average load shape. We're saying, what mix do I have that gets me to carbon-free, carbon neutral, that is, and not spilling too much energy on any given hour, because that's where my load and resources need to match up. So that's how the mix was developed. Where's the wind at? So you'll see that it's a terrible wind area as you start in Kentucky, Tennessee, and move out through the southeast. If you get offshore wind, extremely expensive. If you move off further to the east, and they're trying to do some of that. But the best wind area is right through the Rockies and the Great Plains, and that's not surprising. The wind comes off the mountains and blows really hard out there. That's a long transmission haul. For us, the wind makes more sense. Rob talked about this morning about congestion. The further away you get from your load center, the greater risk you have of congestion. So, for instance, we could put a plant in a plant, I should say, in Hawaii, for instance. And that's a plant that we would have. We say, what's the basis differential between Hawaii and Kentucky? Well, they're not connected at all. There's no, they're so independent, you say, that's a heck of a risk. You weren't really hedging anything. So if you want to hedge your exposure, you want to put your generating assets very close to your load centers to the extent possible. In our case, we'd be going up towards Chicago, somewhere in the Illinois or Indiana area, and there's a darker red up there, and that's where a wind resource could be built. It's a large resource. 350 megawatts is an extraordinarily big wind resource in this part of the country. You see bigger ones like that in Texas and Kansas and Oklahoma and so forth. So that net zero portfolio looks like a couple of internal solar resources. It's our SEPA hydro, and it's a big tie to MISO. And it becomes very simple in that those are the resources you have. That tie to MISO on the other side of it is some solar resources, the ones that won't fit into our system because we've swamped out our load, and because MISO can balance it out, and also the wind resources. So at any given time, we're saying, how much can I buy across that tie? If I can't buy across that tie, I'm going to dump the rest of it into the MISO market. Okay? So keep that in mind. I have excess on a lot of hours that I didn't need that wind, but if the wind's coming because it's blowing and it's a must take, so I'm just going to sell that excess to the MISO market. When you put something that big a wind resource in one area, it's likely going to depress prices greatly. So the locational marginal price of that solar is going to be much lower. So there's a wind resource up there right now called Hoosier that's about 100 megawatts. If you added 350 megawatts more in that area and any other wind that's being built up there, NIPSCO's talking about more renewable resources, for instance. We expect pockets of very low prices, perhaps a lot of negative prices. So if you had, I'll say $25 wind energy, you might be selling it at negative prices where you pay someone to take your energy. So you could be losing money. Those subsidies that go negative because the wind people say, well, heck, as long as I'm getting a production tax credit of nearly $30, I can go negative to a negative $30 and keep running that and get paid by the government if I'm not getting paid by who I have my contract with. So they're trying to make those contracts a little more flexible and dispatchable, but keep in mind the structure of them right now is always based on production and dollars per megawatt hour payments. Okay, so that's the portfolios that we looked at. Near term, we're looking at the RFP responses up through 22, 27, 2029. We're starting to put together some indicative portfolios, we'll call them. There's no commitments to those. There's no need for us to make a commitment to solar for 2030, for instance, or wind for 2030. This is just a long-term plan for us to start thinking about a net zero case, what would that look like? Or a combined cycle case, what would that look like? Now, when the commitments come is when someone said, I need a construction lead time to build something. That's when they come. But right now we're in the year 2000, and that's 10 years away. So let's talk about some results now. The first part is the results that go into the RFP. Preliminary results, we didn't tell you which ones they are, but we've made some runs, and there's different cases on the cents per kilowatt hour. Some jump out better than others. Some of them drop rates very nicely. Some of them kind of have a steady trend, and there's a risk and reward trade-off between those, and both in fixed cost and variable cost, overall cost. And if you look at a kind of a net present value of each of those cost streams, you say, do I do the cheapest one, or do I do something maybe that's more expensive but more flexible? Or do I do something that's a different direction and it gives me some longer term view? So we try to take the near term and make considerations for if those contracts extend past the term, what other things can we do? That's preliminary results. We're still digging them into them. We'll need better numbers perhaps from some of the vendors, but that's our first look at it. And so it's been very useful just to kind of run that through the models and see how they pop out. Very preliminary. On the long term, we do the exact same exercise with our balanced portfolio or our net zero portfolio. Those preliminary results, we looked at average cost. We started in the year 2030. The balanced portfolio is significantly less, not surprising. It's very expensive to buy transmission. and it's very uncertain. We can't even hedge that transmission exposure. So you pay what you pay. So MISO each year on year and PJM and so forth, they're looking at 10% increases every year. So if you had 230 megawatts, 231 megawatts of transmission tied up, and every year you're waiting, kind of crossing your fingers saying, hope it doesn't increase too much this year, that's a long-term exposure to, so if we had a 20-year wind contract in MISO with the exposure of transmission that's not locked up, that's very uncertain. So we made some projections, not over-the-top projections, about the cost of transmission increases. And I read an article the other day. It's very clear that the transmission investors, that's the direction they want to go. They want to keep beefing up the transmission system. They get a rate of return on it, and that's very generous, and they can make big investments. And they're trying to kind of shore up the grid as well and move renewable power around. So there's reasons to make the investment, and but it gets very expensive, and we all have to pay for it. From a CO2 point of view, here's preliminary results as well. And I put something on here that I think maybe not everybody realizes. The gray dotted line, if you remember the Obama Clean Power Plan back in 2015, so they called that the CPP. It was targets that were set by state. They had either a rate target or a mass target, they called it, the total output. This is the rate target we're looking at in pounds per megawatt hour. So they went state by state and they said, here's the target you need to hit by 2030, and then it drops a bit and stays that way and kind of indefinitely. They never really talked much about as they went further out in the future. So that's that dotted line. What's pretty fascinating is if you look at where we're at right now, and to get under that target, we're going to be there in 2022. The world has changed enough with coal retirements. Even when you're buying from the grid, and we said we make assumptions when we buy from MISO, for instance, embedded in that is a CO2 output. You'll notice that that drops down. Now the green line's the interesting one, the net zero. You'll notice it doesn't go down to zero in this case. In reality, it would if I took into account all the sales, excess sales, and said, okay, well they offset it. But in this case, we're buying a great deal from the MISO market, so we track how much we have to buy to make up for our native load, how much is generated off the renewable resources, and that shows it's a low line. It's under 500 pounds per megawatt hour, but you'll notice it's not down to zero. It nets out to a net zero case. The reason we show it that way, at least in this particular one, is everybody needs to realize, it's an important realization, that net zero means you're riding along off somebody else's thermal resources. Kind of like when California said, we're not going to allow coal, for instance, in our area, but they're buying coal from a neighboring system. Well, that's coal. Now, they tried to put on, you can't buy coal from a neighboring system either, and inside the models like Encompass, we try to put constraint sets to say you can't buy a certain technology across it, kind of a trick. It's hard to tag electrons from a different fuel source, but that's really what people try to accomplish. But the Clean Power Plan is something that was kind of considered aggressive at the time, and it's easily going to be met by across the country just by the natural pressures from natural gas and the retirement of coal units. Okay, now let's talk about uncertainty. So the uncertainty piece of our portfolio has to talk about, and Rob laid these out this morning, there's 9 scenarios. It came from our Horizons service that we buy. So they run the entire nation, and they look at different combinations of things. We had high natural gas, remember I showed that graph earlier, low natural gas, high load growth, and so forth. If we run those same cases through our portfolio with their output, we have a national model that shows us where the markets will be under very similar conditions. Because if we have high load growth, generally the whole country is going to have, that's an economic growth type view, or low load growth, we move together. Certainly in fuel prices, we move together. If there's a carbon tax, for instance, what would that do? And those carbon taxes are an interesting idea. It could be that they collect a tax and it's just for the sake of collecting a tax and it's redistributed to someone outside the industry. It could be put into reinvestments in the industry. So I've heard people talk about carbon taxes, and you wonder, when you collect that much money, what's the plan for the money? Does it have anything to do with energy infrastructure, or is it something that's totally different? And we have yet to see a proposal on that, but it's worth a case worth modeling to understand some impacts. Remember RFP responses, dispatchable, non-dispatchable, purchase power versus ownership, and those combinations, they all have those scenarios on them. So these, the number of combinations gets very big very fast, as you'll notice. If you take 8 cases times 9 outcomes, and you have 72 combinations of those things, and you add a few other combinations, it quickly grows. In the long term, we can take the same cases, but fewer options, because these simulation times, as they run out further, take longer and longer, ties up computers literally for days on end. And what we're trying to get is some idea of where things are going in the future. It feels good when somebody says, I want to be 100% carbon neutral by a certain date, to say, okay, well, let's just study that idea and see what it looks like. And we saw that there are ramifications to that. There's also some good aspects to that. It could be under a carbon tax scenario. It could be the best plan, for instance. Keeping in mind a carbon tax scenario is going to raise everybody's prices, so that the overall cost would be more, but you'd have some, and it's going to drive more and more renewables, and it's going to kind of change the infrastructure of the grid that way. Maybe transmission gets much more expensive. So there's always a feedback of what goes on. A carbon tax leads to more transmission, leads to more cost, leads to higher prices for us because we're relying on transmission, for instance. And that's the scenario analysis that we need to consider each time you walk through a case. You say, what are all the things that are going to happen in this possible or plausible future? It's a plausible future. It's not a prediction of any given outcome, but this could happen. And then what happens to our portfolio? If we look at natural gas prices, so I've been around this industry enough, when prices are high and you do your projections, nobody expected them to get as low as they are now. When prices were low, a lot of times nobody expects them to get very high. I think Horizons did a really nice job of saying, okay, there are some cases where prices go high. The most likely case is, and we've heard it discussed already, is a ban on fracking. When you see the history and you see those high natural gas prices back in 2007 and that time period, people were looking at projections of 25% of our gas would come from LNG imports. LNG imports. That's significant. Then along came fracking, the ability to cheaply get natural gas out of the United States, so we became energy independent, drove prices down. If we go back to that world where we can't do fracking, and we're back to horizontal or just vertical drilling, conventional gas wells, if that's allowed, then you're going to see the prices go back up again. It's going to lead to a lot more renewables, a lot more batteries perhaps, but certainly it's going to be a lot of cost increases. Anytime you take away something that was cheaper, economics would dictate the remaining things by design are going to be more expensive, unless that some new technology is developed as a result of that. And those things happen. We're not blind to the idea, but that would be the immediate impact, is a big jump in prices. And so we want to understand that. Market prices follow accordingly. So if you have a jump in gas prices in these models, the models run and said, here's your projection of market prices. Those are the two things that we would feed into our model. So if we have a gas resource in our portfolio, we put in the corresponding gas prices, the corresponding market prices, and we'd run that simulation to understand the impact. Okay, balancing cost and risk. So if we look at the balance there, we talked about this at our last meeting. We do a technique we like to embrace, and that's least regrets scenario planning. So it's easy to say least cost planning, and that always sounds good, but often the question is, well, what does least cost mean? What if it's not least cost under all scenarios? And it's usually never going to be. What if you kind of roll the dice and said, I'm going with this one because it's least cost? Least regrets would suggest that perhaps you don't take the least cost if it's more flexible, for instance. That's maybe a strategy. Or you don't go in 100%. You might say, let's do 20% of this strategy and leave some open on the table for in case something else comes along, and adjust accordingly. And we like to use this graph that shows signpost and a road map. As you're going down the road, and there's always forks in the road, and this happens all the time. You said, boy, the policy's changed, the markets have changed, technology's changed, and I can go a different direction now, a direction I didn't anticipate going, but now that I have enough room in my portfolio, I can kind of veer down this path and take advantage of some of that. In a perfect world, if you knew the path 20 years out in the future, you'd lay it out and just follow it right now, but we don't. And there's this key unknowns that we need to adjust for. So that's the idea of least regrets scenario planning, saying let's look at these candidate resources, run them through these different futures, pretty wide futures, and if one of them continues to win more often than the other ones, if it wins all the time, it becomes the no-brainer, as they call it, saying no matter what we do, this is still the best candidate. Well, that's great news. But likely it's going to be some combination of one plan wins more often than the other, or it's equally balanced, and you want to understand your exposure under each of those cases. That's why we do scenario planning. That's how we balance cost and risk with it. Okay. Let's look at our action plan now. So we're breezing through the afternoon. Gives you plenty of time for questions and public comments again. The action plan is the same roadmap timeline that Michelle showed this morning, and that is we try to follow at certain dates. We want to have things in place. First of all, we did their indicative RFP. If we need to do a second RFP as the board hones in on a strategy, we'll do that, of course. But we need to have something in place, at least to meet a portion of our intermediate capacity and energy needs June 1 of 2022. We might decide to defer some of it and dollar cost average, so to speak, on a strategy, or it could be we just said, you know what, we found what we want to do, and it's a 5-year chunk, and we're just going to do it. And that feels pretty good sometimes too, that you've kind of like a mortgage on a home. You say, I'm just going to lock this in, or I could play a variable rate and see how the market moves. That's how people do their portfolios on their own finances. The goal, again, is to have the IRP report completed by the end of the year. We'll certainly have a lot of the analysis done and available. The report, as I said earlier, that's sometimes a little time consuming, and to get it published and printed and so forth, that might be a bit more. So that kind of breezes through it. And remember that if you want to have any questions, what we'd like to do is start with, if you have any questions, use the chat box to Heather. If you want to have any, make some brief audio comments, just raise your hand. And if you would all raise your hand, if you're going to do that pretty quickly, we'll have an idea if there's 2 people or 10 people, and we can make sure everybody gets an opportunity to speak and maybe limit everyone's comments to a certain time. So Heather, I'll start with you. Do you have any chat questions?
I do. Can you address how uncertainties such as the cost of gas or solar were considered in the analysis?
Yeah, so that uncertainty tree we looked at before has yet to be run, so it will be included in the analysis on our scenarios. If there's one, the public came forward after this and said, you know, there's another uncertainty I'd like you to consider, like a higher transmission line cost or whatever that would be, we'd be happy to run it through and kind of get a feel for it, because we think as people look over these portfolios, they might have a risk they identify as well. So that's certainly something we want to look at, is how to run those uncertainties through.
Thank you. What are the assumptions of any improvements in electrical storage capacity, an example, large-scale battery storage, especially as it might apply to solar power?
So as Rob talked about in the indicative RFP, we had some proposals for solar and storage. So that's some of the things we can consider our analysis and future analysis. We're also trying to watch batteries and understand that technology more. I mentioned this morning. We'd love to have a demonstration project, and we'd like to maybe pursue it if there's anybody that can partner with us on those types of projects to understand how battery storage meshes with our solar. In our case, remember, we can't buy, we're not in a market, so we can't charge the batteries except with something we have inside our system. So we really need to pair it with our solar project or a future solar project.
Thank you. Does KYMEA plan to develop any energy efficiency programs? You may have addressed this.
We talked about that this morning. So our membership, we don't have any customers again. There could be energy efficiency programs that our members are interested in offering. We haven't talked about any of those, a lot of them right now. And a lot of the programs that used to be out there, for instance, I've been at this for a while. We used to mail rebate checks or even mail bulbs in the mail to people. And they were CFL bulbs, and people would get a box of them, they'd put them in. In this particular case, they're at the hardware store now or Lowe's, the big box stores. You can buy very cheap, relatively cheap LED lights that people like much better over the CFLs. And there's probably not a lot of interest in trying to convert people over to lighting when that's the only choice they can buy. There could be other things. I'm always interested in people's setback thermostats, and for them to try to keep their peaks down that way. That's maybe a good promotional item, something we could look at in the future.
You stated that, quote, transmission costs cannot be avoided with distributed solar. It is not allowed by the tariff, end quotes. Which tariff are you referring to? Can you elaborate on this?
Yeah, so LG&E, they charge network transmission service, or it's called NITS. And from that network transmission service, if you have behind the meter generation, they would say you need to add that back to your load as if it were served across that transformer and through that network service. And the reason they have to do that is they need to size the system appropriately to account for the times when that intermittent generation is not available. So they would say you need to add that back through the network transmission tariff. That's our understanding of it as we read the tariff, because we've asked that same question.
How does KYMEA plan to inform the public as to its power supply resources and plans?
Well, certainly the meeting we're having today, the meeting we have in June. So we have public meetings. We think we're doing a good job of this. I know the previous wholesale provider wouldn't have given any opportunity for the public to say, I want to participate in your program. So this is our first effort at it. I'm happy with what we're doing, and I'm pretty proud of the effort. It's a lot of work. We got a production crew here. We have a website we developed. So we went to great expense to make sure the public's able to get feedback, be apprised of what's going on. When our IRPs are available, they'll certainly be published and posted out there, as is our strategic plans are out there right now. So we try to use our website as our kind of our conduit to how we get to the public. Our meetings are open to the public. So if the public wants to come to a meeting and listen in, that's terrific. They're certainly welcome to. And we welcome that. But those are the opportunities. So we're a public agency. We have open records, open access to us, and we're happy to show you what we can. The other thing I always like to point out, though, this is a very competitive business. We're in competition across the nation with others. And there are times you have to say, this is competitive, and if we disclose confidential information, it puts us at a disadvantage, which puts our members at a disadvantage, which puts their customers at a disadvantage. And you don't want your large customers to say, we had to disclose information that put us in a bad position. We could have got a better price were it not for us disclosing that previous price, and now we got a bad price overall for everybody. That's not what we want to do. So there are certain things that, of course, in a competitive marketplace that we deal in, that we are different than our local members, distributors, who don't have those competitive issues the way we do. So it's a little different animal, but we are public power.
Doug, that concludes any questions that I
We're
have
good.
received.
Okay. Michelle, did anybody raise their hand for?
Michelle, during this is Heather, during the public comment, I have received one public comment from a participant who had to exit the meeting early, and she has asked us to read this.
Okay.
So when you're ready, I'll do that.
Go ahead.
Okay. So Chris Schimoller sent this in and asked us to read this because she had to leave. Envision Franklin County is a community group in Frankfort and Franklin County, Kentucky, that promotes a healthy, beautiful, and thriving community and encourages development of results in good relationships among people, the land, and future generations. Envision Franklin County is concerned that KYMEA is considering further investments in coal or natural gas resources. Each of these resources carries unacceptable risks to our community. financial risks for your ratepayers and local governments, public health risks, and risks to our environment and climate. We urge you to commit the KYMEA to achieving 100% carbon-free renewable energy in your power supply by no later than 2030, and reject any new investments in coal or natural gas resources. BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, announced in January that it has begun to center its investment strategy around climate change and is exiting from investments in high sustainability-related risks, such as coal. Over 100 global banks and insurers are restricting investments in thermal coal due to climate risk. In 2019, Vistra, the owner of the Joppa coal plant, which currently supplies KYMEA's members, was ordered by the state of Illinois to shut down 20,000 megawatts of their coal fleet within 6 months to protect air and water quality and public health. The Joppa plant, one of the most polluting power plants in the country, has continued operating in due part to the KYMEA's power contract. Hundreds of major corporations have committed to sourcing 100% of their energy from zero-carbon renewables, including 3M, Coca-Cola, Fifth Third Bank, and General Motors. One of the criteria many of these companies use for siting new facilities is their access to renewable power. The credit rating agency Moody's now assesses the carbon transition risk for electric utilities. In 2018, a report from the world's leading climate scientists warned that global carbon emissions must peak and begin rapidly decline this decade if we are to minimize the catastrophic effects of climate change. In September 2019, millions of young people held marches, rallies, and protests throughout the world, including our hometown of Frankfort and many other towns in Kentucky, to demand urgent action on climate change. The previous examples illustrate that the world is starting to listen. Global capital, corporate investors, and insurers are turning away from fossil fuels. They have finally recognized the financial risk of our current path. With its 100 megawatt Dynegy coal contract expiring in 2022, the KYMEA has a unique opportunity to reduce its exposure to climate risk if it chooses not to invest in any additional fossil fuel resources. Fortunately, the KYMEA has lower cost, zero carbon options available, including solar, wind, battery storage, and demand-side management. We urge you to commit the KYMEA to achieving 100% carbon-free renewable energy in your power supply by no later than 2030 and reject any new investments in coal or natural gas resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. And we've got Chris Woolery that's up next. Go ahead, Chris.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. I'm Chris Woolery. I work at the Mountain Associate in Berea. We're a customer of Berea Municipal Utilities. We also work with other municipalities like Berea and with electric co-ops to provide inclusive financing for energy efficiency retrofits via a tariffed off-bill program called Pay As You Save, or PAYS. Mayor, can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Where did you lose me? I'm so sorry.
Pay as you say.
Okay, so I'll wrap it up. I just wanted to make folks aware that we are now providing residential energy benefits through utilities, including municipalities, and through a financing program that is negligible in terms of effect on rates for the rate base, creates great savings for participants, and in fact also creates
That's,
Yeah, can you see me now?
yes, sir, we can see you.
Okay. I'm a resident of Frankfort Town, Director of Acquisition Climate and Energy Transition. Please consider the following points as you develop your IRP plan for how to meet your customers' electricity needs in the coming years. First, use realistic load forecasting for all member communities. Include analysis of multiple scenarios, including options of high adoption of distributed energy resources, such as energy efficiency, distributed generation, demand response, electric vehicles, distributed energy storage, and building electrification. Evaluate distributed energy resource strategies as resources alongside supply-side measures. Include community and customer benefits in analysis of the cost-effectiveness of DERs. Distributed energy resources take many forms and are now having a major impact on customer energy use in utility planning. DERs offer many local community benefits, not least of which is enabling your customers to reduce their energy costs and achieve greater financial security. Economic development is another significant local benefit of expanded DERs. KYMEA's planning process should anticipate customer interest in DERs, market forces that are driving down their costs and further increasing customer interest, and other forces that are driving DER expansion across the U.S. Some DER strategies, such as energy efficiency or rooftop solar, reduce customer demand and can benefit KYMEA by reducing peak loads and delaying the need for new generating capacity or power contracts. Other DERs, such as electric vehicles and building electrification, can expand KYMEA's load and serve as a growth market for electric generation. In the transition away from fossil fuels into a zero carbon economy, transportation and the heating of buildings are major sectors that remain reliant on liquid fuels, petroleum and natural gas. Carbon emissions from these sectors can be reduced as vehicle and heating systems switch to electricity and the power supply shifts to renewable energy. This creates an opportunity for the KYMEA to increase energy sales while improving environmental performance. The KYMEA should support EV use and building electrification in member communities, in tandem with increasing the percentage of renewable energy in the power supply. Such a strategy could provide multiple benefits for the KYMEA, its communities, and customers. Second, avoid investing in new power supply capacity until it is clearly needed to meet existing member loads. KYMEA records show the agency has at least 60 megawatts of excess capacity beyond its member loads, including reserve capacity. This was true before the pandemic and is not the result of the economic crisis caused by the pandemic. The expiration of the 100 megawatt Dynegy PPA 2022 provides KYMEA's members with a critical opportunity to shed this excess load and cost burden. Members should ensure that any new power supply contracts are necessary for meeting their realistic customer loads. Third, do not invest in any new coal or natural gas power supply contracts or generation resources. Both coal and natural gas generation carry significant financial risks for the KYMEA members and their ratepayers. Throughout the United States, coal generation is becoming increasingly uneconomical. Utilities, large and small, continue to shut down their coal plants in favor of less costly alternatives, namely natural gas, wind, solar, battery storage, and demand-side management. While the cost of fueling, operating, and maintaining coal-fired power plants continues to rise, the cost for wind and solar has been declining for the past decade, a trend expected to continue. We see this trend in Kentucky, where hundreds of megawatts of coal generation have been retired in the past 2 years by Owensboro Municipal Utilities and Henderson Municipal Power and Light. In Indiana, the Northern Indiana Public Service Company, NIPSCO, presented analysis for its 2018 Integrated Resource Plan, finding it can save customers more than $4 billion over 30 years by moving from 65% coal today to 15% coal in 2023 and eliminating the resource by 2028. To replace retiring coal, NIPSCO found that a portfolio of solar storage, wind, and demand management is the most cost-effective, along with a small amount of market purchases from MISO. While cheap natural gas has had a major hand in driving the shutdown of so many U.S. coal plants, market forces and the need to cut carbon emissions places natural gas at a long-term disadvantage relative to wind, solar, and battery storage. This is now leading some utilities to transition directly from coal to renewables plus battery storage without building any new natural gas generation. Utilities in 3 states, Arizona, Colorado, and Florida, announced such plans in June 2020. Southern Indiana Gas and Electric Company presents another example of a nearby utility making a rapid shift from coal and natural gas to renewables. In their 2016 IRP, Sagico proposed building a 700 megawatt combined cycle gas turbine and a 150 megawatt gas-fired peaking plant, along with 54 megawatts of solar. The plan projected their portfolio in 2036 to consist of 78% fossil fuels and 8% renewables. The plan was rejected in April 2019 by state utility regulators, who found that it would leave the utility too dependent on one large-scale generation source, and that the proposed new plant could end up being stranded due to the significant technological changes occurring across the industry, particularly regarding renewable energy resources. End quote. Sagico's updated 2019 would shift their resource mix to 36% fossil fuels and 64% renewables by 2025, while saving their customers an estimated $320 million over 20 years. These trends point to significant risks to the KYME's members from any new investments in coal or natural gas generation, whether that be new construction or contracts with existing power plants. During this time of rapid change in the energy sector, with renewable energy and battery storage costs rapidly falling, and ever-growing demands to regulate or halt the burning of fossil fuels, any new investments in coal or natural gas carries great risks for the KYMEA and its member communities. Number 4, give full consideration to renewable energy, battery storage, and distributed energy resources for meeting any additional energy supply needs. Evaluate the benefits of locating distributed resources within or near member communities to maximize the community and economic benefits. As was noted previously, utilities as close as Henderson and Northern Indiana are making decisive investments in renewable energy because it is now the least cost option. The benefits provided by distributed resources include avoided transmission costs, reduced peak demand, reduced line losses, reduced wear and tear on distribution infrastructure, and local economic development. These and other benefits should be accounted for in the evaluation of distributed resources. Finally, I urge the KYMEA board to adopt a plan to achieve a zero carbon emission 100% renewable power supply by no later than 2030 to support ongoing energy efficiency improvements within your member communities and provide leadership for Kentucky in the energy transition. At least 15 electric utilities in the U.S. have committed to achieving net zero carbon emissions or 100% clean energy, including Duke Energy and Xcel Energy. Thank you for your consideration of my concerns.
Chris Woolery did comment that he'll submit his comments via the website and apologizes for his connectivity issues.
Well, thank you very much, Chris and Andy, for those comments, and everyone else for your questions. That concludes our public group here today, and thank you for attending. I know it's been kind of a long day, and it's take time out of your busy schedules, but we really appreciate the feedback and everything that you've submitted today. Thank you. All right. Thank you very much.